Hi, everyone. Welcome to Turning Point, Stories and Strategies from the World of Business. And I'm your host, Blaine Birch, co-founder and CEO at Dryrun. And I'm really excited today to have joining me Erin Bury, co-founder and CEO at Willful. Thanks for joining me today, Erin.
Thanks for having me, Blaine. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we just to give a little bit of background, we met through an Intuit program that we're both in. Intuit, one of the largest accounting software on the planet, and we're part of what's called the Intuit Prosperity Accelerator. And there's a bunch of companies that are actually 8 companies that are working to help both individuals and businesses get through this current pandemic-related challenge that we have right now. But the big side benefit for me especially was to get to meet all these other entrepreneurs that I hadn't met before, hear about some really cool businesses and innovation that's happening in different spaces. And but with you, Erin, before we get forward to what you're doing today with Willful, I wanted to kind of, harken back to the start. Where did you get started in business, and what are some of the things that you've worked on?
Yeah, well, I have to say, I don't know about you, Blaine, but I was not someone who aspired to be an entrepreneur. I don't even think I knew what an entrepreneur was when I was growing up. Both of my parents worked at Nortel, worked for big corporate for decades. And so my dream was to grow up and have a corner office like my mom and get to go to trade shows and go for fancy dinners. So I went to journalism school just like she did with a goal of working in marketing. She seemed to have a really glam job planning advertising campaigns, although they were for fiber optics, which wasn't the sexiest topic, still a very cool job. So that was my goal: go to journalism school, get a job in marketing, get that corner office. And then about a year after I graduated, I was working at a PR agency, and I was recruited to go be the second employee at a startup, which was a social network for entrepreneurs that was called Sprouter. And that just completely changed the trajectory of my career. My job at Sprouter was meeting entrepreneurs and hearing their stories and helping them connect and educating them about how to use social media to grow their brands. And I just completely fell in love with the origin story behind every great business and caught the entrepreneurial bug myself. So I spent a couple of years as a journalist putting that degree to good use on the founding team at BetaKit, the startup publication, and then kind of pivoted into running my own business and marketing agency for consumer tech companies. So did that for about 6 years, and then that brought me to Willful, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit.
That's really kind of funny because this story, I had an agency as well. My father worked at AGT, which is a telecommunications in Alberta here. But he actually did work for the predecessor of Nortel, which is, I think it's Northern Telecom, if I remember right. So it's funny because we were in Ottawa for a couple of years, and he was working at what would become Nortel. And my father-in-law also works. So it's like telecommunications seems to be like this massive theme for people that, I don't know, dive into entrepreneurship. I think it's kind of funny.
Yeah, and that means that your family probably experienced the Nortel stock going way up and then way down, which was a big event in my teen years.
Yeah, that was probably just a little bit after he was sort of loaned out to Nortel for a couple of years and came back to Alberta. And but interesting, because it was the same thing with me. As none of my parents were entrepreneurial. I never thought of myself as entrepreneurial, and I felt like when I went and started my first business, it was sort of unintentional. I felt like I was sort of pulled there on autopilot, and suddenly I'm like, I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur, and suddenly I just was. And it was almost like subconsciously I was, but consciously didn't really think about it. And interesting anyways, because I know so many of the people I've talked with they have entrepreneurial aspirations right from birth. And I feel like the back of my mind did, the front of my mind maybe didn't. So, but so you were a little bit like me. You worked for someone for a very short time, and then started your first business. And tell me a little bit about that agency that you started and how that sort of developed.
Yeah, so I should clarify, I didn't start the agency from the ground up, but don't want to take credit when it wasn't my idea. It was actually born out of a real estate software company. So the founders were using social media to grow their own business because they were a startup. And so social media was great back in 2008, 2009, 2010, because it was free and nobody else was really using it. So it was a natural place for small businesses to go to market their companies. And their clients were all big condo builders. And so they, saw how this business was using social media to grow. They had no clue where to start. So said, hey, can we just hire you guys to do it? So it was kind of an accidental agency that was born out of this software company. So I was hired to come in and actually kind of build that as a separate brand, as a separate division of the company. And then after about 2.5 years, we actually spun it out as a separate legal entity and really separated the two. So when I started as the managing director there, we were almost exclusively working with condo developers, which was, a learning curve for me. My background was in technology and working with startups. And all of a sudden I was learning the world of pre-construction condos in Toronto, which was very new, but it was interesting, right? I look back on that and I'm grateful that I had a chance to learn, because now I'm actually sitting in a condo that we bought from one of our clients that we bought in 2014 and wasn't ready till 2020, because that's the joy of pre-construction real estate in Toronto. But really my passion was, and when I joined, it was always with the intention to build it out into an agency that focused on working with startups and with tech clients. And that was for two reasons. Number one, I was passionate about it. And number two, I saw a huge opportunity. There were all of these big agencies that catered to the big tech companies like the HPs and Dells and PayPal's, and yet there weren't very many agencies that were kind of catering to the emerging startup space. And there were lots of really interesting companies that were coming out around this time, like Wattpad and Wealthsimple. And so I just kind of identified a bit of a niche that existed for public relations services and graphic design and digital marketing that catered to funded startups, startup accelerator programs like Next Canada, VC firms like Round 13 Capital. And we carved out really a niche for ourselves. We really switched our client list from those condo developers to funded tech companies and people in the ecosystem, and became kind of the go-to agency, at least in Toronto, for working with the tech industry, which was really great.
It's just as when you sort of talked about, how you worked your way through and then spun it off and stuff. It's interesting because, when I'm talking with all these other entrepreneurs, all you see is, CEO of this company or this company, that. When you start asking about it, it's interesting because there's this little roundabout path and little opportunity here and challenge there. And it just sort of, it's interesting to hear that how things actually come together. It's never quite as sort of neat and tidy as people think. A lot of times it's opportunity and sort of seeing where you go. So you said you were back in, I'm just trying to picture a little bit. I know 2008, 2009 was when, we were, had just expanded our business a bit and they got hit with the financial slowdown and all of that. And this was the time that you actually kind of started in on this opportunity. I'm just wondering how the landscape appeared to you back in 2008, 2009, as things are slowing down, but then you have this this opportunity to market businesses. Was part of it stemmed out of the slowdown, or was it just more of a technology that was suddenly available that really wasn't before?
Yeah, so the agency was really 2013 until 2019. The startup that I joined was in 2008, at the end of 2008. And I remember it clearly because it was the height of the recession and I had this job offer to go work at a startup. And pretty much all of my friends were like, are you crazy? It's the height of a recession. Why would you go be the second employee at a startup? What is a startup? What is a social network for entrepreneurs? I have no idea what this is. Stay at this PR agency where you're working, you're getting a steady paycheck, you can move up the ranks. And thankfully, even though my mom had this kind of corporate career, when I asked her, she said, do it. Like, you're 23 years old? Like, this is the time to go take a risk. And the worst that happens is you have to go and get another job if it doesn't work out. And I'll forever be grateful that she pushed me into that. But yeah, I mean, I think it was this interesting time. If you remember back in kind of 2008 to 2010, Facebook was just going beyond schools. And there was kind of two major trends. The first was the business model of amassing users, right? Like we didn't have a business model at the time. You didn't pay. It was a free social network, which was very similar to Facebook. It was really the users becoming the product instead of the users paying for the product. And then the second shift was just social media, right? This idea of mass social networks like Facebook, as well as niche social networks that targeted different interest groups, really becoming mainstream, and social media going beyond just a fad that people thought would, pass really quickly into something that actually became a core part of people's communication strategies and personal lives. And so it was really exciting to be part of a startup that, we ended up growing to kind of hundreds of thousands of members. And I got to travel to places like Paris to attend conferences like Le Web. And really, it was during this exciting time. I remember we had a booth at TechCrunch Disrupt in, I guess it must have been 2009, 2010. And one of the booths about 2 over from us was this little company called Air Bed and Breakfast, which now you know as Airbnb. Yeah. And this was like, a tiny little card table with them have, no swag, no awareness. And you think about some of the companies from that era who are now the biggest tech companies in the world. It's just really exciting to be a part of that. I love just getting to meet all these founders, and not all of their businesses worked out, obviously, but it was just an exciting time to be in social media and an exciting time to be growing a startup.
And so I imagine those sort of experiences, your first step into a startup, and then you went into, your own business and your own venture. But I imagine that is what sort of planted some of the seeds for Willful further down the road. And
well, very much so, because again, I'm the first to say I am not an ideas person. I am very good at you having an idea and you bringing me in to grow it into something that is recognizable. So the seeds for Willful, which was my husband's idea, he's now my co-founder, were very much planted as a part of embedding myself into the startup community. Kevin was working in trades. And when you work at an early stage startup, your boyfriend, family, whoever, they end up becoming unofficial employees, right? So when I was the second employee at this company, we would host events for the startup community, and they had, 500 attendees a month, and we'd have really amazing speakers. And he would obviously be working the door and accepting, registrations, because we just didn't have, we had 3 employees. So we had to pull people in, whether it was interns or significant others. And that really was he's always been that born entrepreneur who has an idea every 5 seconds. So he's always been that different kind of entrepreneurial mindset for me. But I think when going from working in trades and not really being around people that had those entrepreneurial aspirations, to then being embedded in the Toronto startup scene, meeting all these entrepreneurs and realizing, oh, there's actually a place for these ideas to go, and I can actually build something from nothing. That was the seeds for Willful that were planted then, with him realizing I want to be an entrepreneur, and then me realizing I don't know if I'm ever going to be the person that has the great idea, but I'm going to hone my skills in, being on the founding team at BetaKit, growing that early stage startup at Sprouter, growing this agency into something meaningful. That gave me the confidence that when he had the idea for Willful, it was something that I could grow.
So, yeah, and before we get into Willful, I'm curious about this agency that you said, you took it and you grew it, and pretty soon you were the agency in Toronto, but you still have this really tight connection to the startup community. So it's, I'm curious how that sort of experience of building that agency up prepared you for when you take the leap into Willful.
Yeah, I think fundamentally running an agency is not dissimilar from running a product company. There's obviously a few key differences in that agencies typically don't raise external funding. Now, that's not true of all agencies. I absolutely know some who have taken outside funding, especially if they're building products and offering services at the same time. That's the biggest difference to me, is that typically you grow an agency as you grow your client list. It starts with a couple people, and then as you get more clients, you grow it. And obviously your relationship with your customers is very different at a product company. We have thousands of customers, whereas at my agency, we had a client list of, 10 companies. And we were tracking our time. Really, the people that worked for the agency were the product, instead of at a software company where the software is the product. But the fundamentals of running a business are the same, right? You still have to make more money than you have in your bank account. You still have to hire and retain a great team. You still have to have a product that your customers love, whether that product is marketing services or online wills. So I think the fundamentals of growing a 7-figure business were easily applied over to Willful, but there are some fundamental differences, like going out and raising venture capital funding and learning how to run a product and engineering team for the first time, that have been a steep learning curve, that's for sure.
Yeah. And you know what, I'd like to actually dive into, Willful now, just because there is so much interesting stuff in actually building that sort of company. But what was the transition for you? Like, did you just decide one day that you wanted to dive into Willful, or did you sort of close, or sell off that previous company, or how did that sort of transition happen?
Yeah, so it was about 5 years in at the agency, and I had been working, I worked with an agency coach named Carl Sakis, and it was one of the best things I ever did, because, my background wasn't in agency operations. And so working with him was really a great way to kind of build my skill set in terms of actually running an efficient and profitable agency. And one of the things that we worked on over time was what he called being needed but not necessary, because there's this idea that when you probably experienced this as well, when you are an agency owner, you typically work hands-on with a lot of the clients in the early days. And as the agency scales, it's just not feasible for you to be having your hands in everything. So we really worked on, okay, how do we actually create an onboarding process that doesn't involve me? Can we hire a salesperson, which we did, so that I'm not the first point of contact, and get it to the point where clients never even interact with me, because we have such a great client service and sales team. And it was when the end of 2018, Kev and I got married in October. We went on our honeymoon for 3.5 weeks to Australia, Fiji, and New Zealand, which was the most incredible trip ever. And I told the team, I'm here if you need me, but don't bother me unless it's urgent, because you only get one honeymoon, hopefully. And don't bother me unless it's urgent. And they didn't contact me once in 3.5 weeks. And it was this kind of wake up call of like, I've done it. I've made myself needed but not necessary. But that also came with this realization that I wasn't learning anymore, right? And either I had to sit back and build a plan to take the agency to the next level, because we were about 15 people, but did I want to grow it to 50 people, or did I want to sell it and, become part of a larger agency network? Or did I want to recognize that I did what I came here to do, and it's time for a new challenge? So it was very much the latter for me. It was a recognition that I'm ready to go do something else where I feel uncomfortable, where I'm learning a new skill set. And it wasn't Willful. My plan was to take a few months off. So I left the agency. That the agency ended up merging with another agency, and that was that. And my goal was to take a few months off, but Kev, my husband, was running Willful. So he had launched the company about a year earlier. I was an investor and an advisor, and as spouse of an entrepreneur, you're also de facto part of the company, whether you want to be or not. Yeah. And so when I made a list of, and I think anyone listening who's ever, been faced with this crossroads in their career, that figuring out what you want to do with your life is one of the hardest things that you're ever faced with, right? And instead of thinking about what company I wanted to work at, I wrote down a list of all of the things I loved about any of the early stage opportunities I had been a part of. And it was a list that I held up and realized, oh my God, this is exactly what I would get if I were to join Willful. It was building out a team from scratch, building out a nascent brand into something recognizable, implementing operational efficiency, process and HR policies, like all of these things that I really love, managing people. So that was really the moment where it was like, oh, you basically started the opportunity that I need to go work at. Kev, how do you feel about having your wife on board as CEO? And luckily he was very amenable to it, and the rest is history.
No, that's such an interesting story, and it's amazing the role spouses play. My wife has to listen to me, talk business and everything else all the time, of course, and you try not to. It's pretty tricky, right? But it's and I can see how important it is to have a spouse that's at least really supportive. I think it'd be almost impossible to do otherwise. But then to have somebody that's actually joining in the business is really interesting. And that you guys have such complementary, aptitudes is really quite cool too. So, so you joined Willful, and how did you guys take it from that starting point to where you are now? Because I know you have investment, you've growing fast, you've got all this really great stuff happening. What is some of the journey there to get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're running a product company or a service business, you have to be intentional about the type of company that you're trying to build. So we could have absolutely made Willful a lifestyle business, right? We could have just turned on some Google AdWords and gone and sipped Mai Tais on the beach and collected enough to pay our bills, but that very much was not the intention. The intention with Willful was to build a scaling tech company, to take external funding, both because we thought that's what the opportunity and product and market needed, but also because we wanted that personal learning. If I had one goal for Willful, it was get outside my comfort zone, get the experience doing all of these things that venture-backed companies need experience with, whether that's managing and running a board of directors or raising external funding or hiring and managing a product and engineering team. So we were pretty intentional when I joined that was the path that we wanted to go on. And luckily, right when I joined in the spring of 2019, we were accepted to Founder Fuel, which is one of the top startup accelerators in Canada in Montreal. So luckily we got to move to Montreal for 5 months in the summer, the year before COVID hit. So it would have been a very different virtual experience. And you're smiling because we've been going through this Intuit Accelerator virtually, and it probably would be a much different experience if we were able to go through it in person. But that was really, I think, the catalyst for us, and it was just such an energizing force. We had just hired our now CTO, Matt, in February of 2019, just prior to me joining. So the three of us moved to Montreal and went through this program. And it was just that kind of the thing that got us to the next level. It gave us a lot of rigor and process and external mentorship and introductions to investors. And it gave us a timeline of, hey, you're getting on stage in July in front of 1,000 people. So you better show them that you've made some progress, and you better have your stuff figured out in terms of where you're going next and the market and the problem that you're solving. And so that, to me, I identify as one of the biggest catalysts for us. And then obviously raising funding during the beginning of COVID in 2020 was another accelerant that just allowed us to go beyond, living within our means as a company, and to actually expand our burn rate strategically through bringing on people that could help us achieve our vision.
So, and that's kind of an interesting thing. So you took on funding, right as this sort of pandemic has started, and I imagine the vision for the company, I imagine like that hasn't changed, but the operations of it, I'm sure must have changed, and just because now you're trying to expand the team and expand this business while everyone's kind of stuck at home. Like how are you guys sort of managing through that?
Yeah, well, I think I was saying this to you when we chatted the other week about the mentality of running an agency is very different from the mentality of losing money every month intentionally, right? When you run an agency and you don't have external funding, if you don't make more than you spend every month, you are very quickly going to have a business that is not able to operate, or you're going to have to find debt or whatever to cover that. So with an agency, it was the biggest concern I had was how can I spend less that I'm bringing in and make sure that my agency is turning a profit? Versus a tech company, when you take money and they intentionally tell you you have to lose money because that's the whole point of bringing on funding. And actually you're reaching cash flow positive too soon. And so we better spend more money or be more aggressive with our growth targets. So that was a real shift for me. At Willful, we had been cash flow positive, not since the launch, but when I joined in April of 2019, I think by September, we were cash flow positive. And that was through being extremely lean. We were not paying ourselves as founders. We were investing very sparingly in team members. We were keeping overhead low through borrowing office space. And, we probably spent a lot on drinks in Montreal. That's probably fair to say. But other than that, our operating expenses were pretty low. And then all of a sudden, we were cash flow positive up until the point that we raised funding. And it was very weird to go from not losing money and not seeing your bank balance go down to intentionally increasing your burn rate. So that mindset shift was probably the strangest thing for me. And then concurrently, COVID hit, and we are very fortunate to be a business that succeeded during COVID. When COVID hit, we sell online wills. There was a lot of anxious and scared Canadians who had put off getting their emergency planning documents for a long time. So we saw a massive increase in traffic and sales when COVID hit. And we have, while that initial rush has abated, we've certainly seen that the interest in our product has been heightened because of COVID. So it was more so about the mental health of our team, and I'm sure you would say that as well. The challenge was, how the heck do you help manage people's mental health when we're going through the absolute busiest period in our history? We're doubling our team size through a pandemic where nobody's actually met each other in person. And so it was more just about how to do that thoughtfully while staying true to our values as a company with our external marketing. And I think I'm proud of how we handled that, and the fact that, I think we treated everyone well and stayed true to our values while going through that transition.
There's a lot to, I think, unpack there with the how you manage the team and everything. But there was something there that you said that I just wanted to pop in and discuss a little bit, because this is something that a lot of people outside of entrepreneurship, and especially outside of the startup world, the tech startup world in particular, don't really appreciate or understand. Moving from like when I started my agency, like I always say, we were cash flow positive. We hung up our sign, which went right beside the contract we had landed to start the business, right? That's kind of why we went that way. And so I felt like, we have money right away. I got a paycheck day one. But you said that you guys, were really lean because, the founders weren't getting paid and all that. And this is what I hear so often. And I experienced it personally as well, is for entrepreneurs, it's just like, no, I just didn't get paid for a while. Right. And for me personally, I didn't get paid for years because I didn't take in funding, but I was putting cash in, like a lot of cash too. So that there's a sort of this double whammy. And at times it feels like especially right now, all the talk is, coming out of the pandemic, startups are going to carry our world forward. And I think there's a lack of understanding at times that the tech startups that are doing this, the founders in the end are the ones that are really, they're the ones with the skin in the game. They're taking the bullet. They're not getting paid, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And there isn't a whole lot of support until you bring in outside funding. There's really zero support. And then of course, with that outside funding comes a lot of, like you're talking about, the pressures, the responsibilities, the grow, it's not just your vision or operation anymore. There's other people involved. I just wanted to get your feelings a little bit on that. Like you've dealt with so many different startups in Toronto. You're part of the startup community now. Like, how does that sort of affect your view of entrepreneurship, that the entrepreneurs just don't get paid for a while?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is it's extremely privileged to say I am a founder that was able to not pay myself, but still pay my bills, and that I was able to raise friends and family funding. I think we often overlook the fact that if you can say that you raise friends and family funding, that means you have friends and family with money. And even though that might have been only $5,000 checks from a bunch of people in our network, that's still very privileged to be able to go to your friends and family and be able to start a business. And when Kev started the business, I was working at the agency doing well. So he got to quit his job working at a cement plant and work on the business full time. And not every founder gets to do that. A lot of them are working full-time jobs to pay the bills and burning the midnight oil working on their startup. And even when I joined and both of us were not taking a paycheck, I do paid speaking engagements and had, supplementary income coming in to pay the bills. So I want to acknowledge that, it sounds very like I was eating ramen noodles, but like I'm 35. I was not going back to eating ramen noodles. So I just found other ways to hustle to supplement that. We have an Airbnb that we rent out. Like we just found other ways to make it work. And I would say our liquidity definitely was very nefarious for a while there, but at the same time, we didn't have to take loans from friends and family. We didn't go into debt because of it. And I think that's very privileged. I think it is one of those things where most people don't not take a paycheck. They just work their full-time job and start it on the side. And then they don't take a paycheck for a while once they decide, okay, I've saved up enough. Like there's typically, my best friends just started a business called Mahara, which is like a mindfulness journal that they sell now at Chapters. And they thought of the business 4 years ago. They both worked full-time in communications and saved up a bunch of money for 3 years so that they could leave, not take a salary, knowing they had no idea when they were actually going to make money, and then, take a salary at some point in the future, which I don't think they are yet, right? So it's kind of just expected. I don't know that it's right. And once you get to a certain point, if you raise funding, your investors want you to be making money. They don't want you moonlighting, working at Starbucks. They want you focused 110% on the business. So there's a shift when you take money from investors from pay yourself as little as possible, spend as little as possible to, no, I want my founders to be paid well because I want you to feel incentivized. But sorry, Blaine, I feel like I'm rambling, but there's another point I wanted to make, which is just, there's also this, I learned working at my first startup that you have to separate you as a startup employee from you as the founder. Because when I worked full time and I was one of 3 people, I worked all the time. And I felt guilty when I would like go out with my girlfriends as a 24-year-old because my founder, Sarah, who's an amazing person, was always working. And she didn't ask me to, but I just inherently felt guilty. It took me years to realize she's the one with the skin in the game. She's the one who's passionate about this idea. She should be spending more time than me. And that's not to say I shouldn't be busting my butt and working really hard, but I always try to remember that as a founder, I have way more skin in the game, which means I have more risk. I also have, I work on Sundays when my team members shouldn't be. I'm thinking about it at 1 a.m. I have more stress. That's what comes with being a founder. And if you don't want that, that's no problem, but then don't be a founder, right? Go get a job at a startup where you can make a very nice salary if you go to a Series A startup and still work hard, but not have any of that risk associated.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, like, I guess that I'm sort of alluding to is that, like, I feel exactly like you, like I'm a little bit older. I feel like I was privileged to be able to, like, I could start the company and I didn't have to take money. And I'm like, no, I'll find a way, and because I wanted to have that, that I guess early on, that sort of control or vision. And now it's like, well, now we want to grow this. It's a very different situation. And I guess more in my mind is, this is what I see of founders all the time is they are like burning the midnight oil. They're doing side gigs. They're running a business and trying to, and I've done that in my last business. We started building some product and still trying to, feed one into the other. And part of me says, that I really like the guts and the stick-to-itiveness, and that maybe helps an entrepreneur succeed because they have to do that. But part of me also thinks, I wonder what kind of entrepreneurial, like innovation juggernaut Canada could be if you had founders with drive and a terrific idea and all of these things kind of coming together, and they're not working 3 jobs, right? Like, and so this is just there is no real answer to it, but I just look at it and think like that is one of the barriers to innovation is literally the founders, because none of this happens without the founders going, I'm just going to pick this up and do something that, like the famous quote, it's like jumping off a cliff and building the airplane on the way down. Like you have to be a little bit, like you have to be a little bit, I don't know what it is, why we would just jump and go, yeah, I'm going to do this and it's going to work. And you have this belief that it's going to work and this drive. But I wonder now that coming out of this pandemic, and we want innovation to help drive the country forward. And I look and go, yeah, it's even going to be harder because now there's even less resources. There's less of a bankroll. There's less of these side gigs potentially than there was. Maybe, I don't know. I just more of a thought, I guess.
Well, Blaine, we could have a completely different episode on the lack of early stage funding options for entrepreneurs. But I can tell you, I mean, we not funded, but our personal credit cards managed all of Willful for the first couple of years because we couldn't find, even though we had money in the bank, even though we generated revenue from the day we launched, we could not find anyone that would give us even $1 of credit that wasn't personally guaranteed. And I have gone on many a Twitter rant about the fact that, you know, you basically have to be doing $1 million a year in revenue before any of the banks will even give you a credit card worth $5,000 that doesn't have your personal assets guaranteeing it. I still, at this stage in Willful, only have a charge card that I have to pay off in full every month. That's the most I can get, even though we've done, you know, 7 figures in revenue last year. So I really think it's that early stage gap that exists that, to your point, is actually stopping a lot of people. Like if I could wave a magic wand and have BDC do anything, it wouldn't be the personally guaranteed loans that are impossible to get unless you have perfect credit and a house to sign up against it. It would be giving $25,000 grants to entrepreneurs without having to put in a business plan like it's 1992, a solid idea, you know. Grants to get people started would actually be, even if it was just to replace their salary for 3 to 6 months so that they could start working on it, I think it would, to your point, really transform the number of people who are able to start businesses.
Well, and it's the, like you hit the nail on the head of one of the, I don't want to call it a dirty little secret, but is one of the major stresses for entrepreneurs, especially in Canada, is if you take money in, you have a personal guarantee. Like, and it's so even now, like we see a lot of businesses failing, and a lot of them have a bunch of cash that they owe. They've been paying it off religiously every month, but they have that personal guarantee on it. And it isn't that when a business fails, it's not an entrepreneur just, well, now I'll just go out and get a job. There is this massive pressure, debt, everything that goes along with it. And so all these things dissuade entrepreneurs with really terrific, you know, ideas to carry forward and really try and build something. And at times you look back, like I look back to times and go, like, what was I nuts doing this? But it's like you go too far, like you've already jumped off the cliff and you're halfway down before you go, oh man, really realize all of this, right?
Well, and you reward it when it's positive, right? Have you ever watched Shark Tank or Dragon's Den? And you hear the story of the business that is doing gangbusters and they put a second mortgage on their house and they did X, Y, Z, but it's okay because the company is doing well. Well, for every story that ends well, there's the one where, you know, they lost their house and they lost everything because of the money they sunk into it or the personal guarantees. And there were some vocal small business owners earlier in the pandemic who had physical retail locations. And that was what they were really saying was the issue with all of the COVID relief programs is we don't need more loans. I already have enough loans as a small business owner. I've already put up all of my assets as collateral for this business. A loan inherently means I'm going to have to pay you back. And I have no idea if my doors are going to be open in 3 to 6 months. And I'm not saying the solution is give everyone free money, but I do think that there's a way to structure, like organizations like Futurepreneur give out loans only up until age 30, but at least it's something. And I'm sure there are programs in Alberta and Ontario that do help folks, but especially when you're not in one of the startup centers like Toronto, you're not always aware of those options or privy to them. It's very difficult to build your network. So there's also this challenge of what do you do when you don't have a network like mine, because I've worked on the ground in Toronto for 10 years, meeting investors and all of the important people. I was able to go to a bunch of Shopify employees and say, hey, you have a bunch of money from it going public. Do you want to invest in Willful? Well, if I live in North Bay, I'm not going to be able to do that, right?
Yeah. And it's, and you reminded me that, you know, it feels like so different even a year ago, but early on in the pandemic, there was, I remember we would talk, we talked with more than one business that were figuring out how to wrap up their business, that were figuring out how to close it. And the reason, and I had actually forgot about it till you just mentioned it, but the reason was the personal guarantee that they could take in a really big loan And these were businesses that have been around a long time. And they just, there's business owners that are in their, probably 50s, maybe even into their 60s saying, I either shut this down and I lose a couple $100,000, or I take on $1 million, a couple $1 million loan. Don't know how long this is going to go. Don't know if I'm going to survive. And the personal guarantee would financially sink me. These are businesses that have a lot of employees that are around, have been around a long time. And I don't know how the programs changed and shifted and sort of what happened, but I do know there's businesses that were shutting down really quickly. And some that were, I still remember ones that we were talking about with them in the summer, and they're going, yeah, well, I'm shutting down. They had a date, October, whatever, January, whatever. They already knew where they were headed, because they just couldn't take that sort of risk on. And I know we're kind of getting off track here, but it's this, there's all these things that are underneath decisions for entrepreneurs. And it's a hard task, and there's going to be some incredible innovation coming out of this time. And there's going to be some incredible opportunity. There's going to be a lot of really hard stories as well that, those are the ones that people probably don't want to hear about. So they probably won't hear about.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And I mean, even running our businesses, I mean, I always laugh at the beams where it says, as an entrepreneur, 10 a.m. could be the happiest you've been in a year, and 2 p.m. could be the worst you've felt in a decade, right? Every single day. I always describe it to Kev, and we're lucky in that we live with each other. We can talk to each other about it. We have an outlet, but I always describe it as kind of being on the edge of panic. Like, even if you don't feel stressed or panic, that it could be around the corner, whether that's, a bad customer review, or an employee leaving, or, not being able, getting another no from an investor, which even if you are Airbnb, you heard no hundreds of times through your journey. It's an inevitable part of it. So there's not just the risk of the finances, whether that's not taking a salary or personally guaranteeing loans. There's also just the mental side of it, which is sometimes, I always say to Kev, like, imagine the people that just have a government job and they go to work and then they go home. Well, I guess right now they go from their living room to their couch, but they don't take work home with them. And there's really not skin in the game. Not saying they don't work hard, but it's just different when you have your own business. You have so much kind of on your shoulders beyond just the day-to-day work. And I love it. And I can't ever imagine going and working for someone else again. But some days I fantasize about having a 9-to-5 job.
Because and I've said this before to, other founders, and that is when things have gone really bad, like, you have that anxiety and stress because something has gone bad. And what I tell myself now when something like that happens, or something that is really hard, I always think back, I know the feeling really well. I know that stress and that feeling. But if I think back for the last couple of years, I can't actually remember what the circumstances were, because they probably actually weren't in the end that big of a deal, but it hits you kind of like a truck. And that's how I try. And sometimes I think about it and think, yeah, I've been through this. I know the feeling really well, but whatever the circumstance, I won't remember in a month down the road, because there'll be 1,000 good things and 1,000 bad things that have happened since then. And it's just, it's a unique journey. And I know that I hear this from entrepreneurs who are just like me. I'm like, I wouldn't do anything else, but man, what is in my brain that gets me to do this and not just kind of do something what would be probably sensible. The last thing I just wanted to touch on, just a tiny bit, I know we've been on for a while here, but just a little bit about, like you're building out this team, and you're sort of forced into, how do we grow? And you're building a team, and you haven't met, like, I have staff I haven't met in person, and I have staff that I've met like once or whatever, twice, or, how is that changing in Willful? Like, how are you expanding the team, and how is that sort of working? Do you think it'll keep, is it all remote? Do you think you'll stay with a lot of remote, or how do you envision a year and a half from now it changing?
Yeah, I mean, we signed our first ever office lease on February 1st, 2020. So we didn't even get to have our office warming party, Blaine, and then we moved completely remote. So I feel lucky in one sense, because it's a small office space. It's not costing us $200,000 a month. And because Kevin and I work together and live together, he goes in every day. So it actually is very nice to have a little bit of separation there. But I think what we've all learned, and I think you'd probably agree, is the benefits of working remotely and working from home. Our team loves working from home. They don't love being in lockdown. They don't love not being able to see their family and friends. But I cannot imagine that if COVID was over tomorrow, anybody would come in 5 days a week. So I think we really, in a year and a half, we'll have a central office as a hub where some people may choose to go in every day. Some people may choose to go in once a week or once a month. We actually just today, our first full-time remote employee starts. She's from just outside Calgary. So she is an Albertan, and she's never going to come into the office full-time because she doesn't even live in the same province. And maybe we'll bring her out quarterly for team building things. But I very much anticipate that 90% of businesses, at least software businesses like ours, will have a central hub or even rent part of a co-working space, but will largely operate on this flexi schedule. And I think it's a good thing. I don't think people are going to want to go back to the office. And, we've done a lot of work on how can we actually engage people remotely. And it's different. Our Christmas party was building gingerbread houses over Zoom, but, it was still fun. And to be honest, I didn't wake up with a hangover the next day and went to bed at 10 p.m., which is not the same as Christmas parties past. So there's also benefits of remote culture. And if anything, I don't know about you, Blaine, but I'm so grateful that I'm not out at networking events every night and I'm not shuttling myself from investor meeting to investor meeting. I'm getting so much more done and I have so much more downtime to either work more or, cook dinner, which is not something I ever did before the pandemic.
It's and what used to be our kind of dirty little secret is our team has always been all remote, and we're from coast to coast. We got some in BC, some in Alberta, some in Ontario, and we like now we're kind of going, oh, maybe eventually we'll actually have, like you said, like a couple little satellite offices sort of thing. But we've been hiring intentionally, and it's just we've always been remote, and part of that because I, up until this COVID year, spent half my time in the U.S. and now I'm kind of stuck in minus 40 in Edmonton here today. It's been really interesting to see how the rest of the world is sort of going towards. It's just like we've always sort of been doing that, but we're starting to look at, post-pandemic again, like as we grow our team, how do we get a little bit more face time? And, early on in the pandemic, the one thing I don't miss is airports and getting on planes and hotels and stuff. But what I'm starting to miss was the interaction when you'd be at a trade show with all of these other, other entrepreneurs that we would see at every one of these events and get to talk with and catch up with, and actually having some of our staff where you actually get together a little bit in person and that. So it's taken a while, but I'm starting to miss some of those things. And
I miss hotels, Blaine. Oh my God. I love a good hotel. Not like a hotel that you don't want to be on that trip and you're just going through the motions, but man, I don't miss planes, but I miss hotels.
I don't miss hotels. I'm the opposite. And I've been lucky to be in some real, especially all these conferences and stuff. Sometimes we've been to some really nice ones, but I still just rather be like home in my own bed. And my co-founder, he probably won't hear this, but if he does, he's the one that will go to, some event somewhere and he'll go find some just interesting Airbnb, like just some developer, I don't know what he calls them, crash pads or something, because he just wants to meet people and hang out. And now we couldn't even be able to do that because he wants to have that sort of experience with me. I'm like, I'm at one nice hotel room, and that's not even quite my favorite sort of thing. But it's, I guess it'll come back. I don't know. I think it could be years till we're off to the sort of events and things that we were at before. The virtual events are nothing like in person, but the lift and the difficulty and the timeline for those, I think it's going to be quite a long time. So it'll be interesting to see how that all lays out. But I'm glad we're both in businesses that actually can work remotely and our clients can come to us. So it's that I feel very privileged to be in that sort of industry and that sort of business that we can do that.
Yeah, likewise.
I guess we've been talking for a long time. We better I let you get on with the rest of your day here. But where can people find you if they want to learn more about Willful and chat with you?
Yeah, so I'm at Erin Bury on every social network, and it's Willful, WILLFUL.co. So if you don't have a will, check us out. And thank you so much for listening, and thanks for having me, Blaine. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erin. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it's nice to talk tech startup. A lot of businesses and owners I've been talking with, they're just different sectors, and to talk that tech startup is really, really enjoyable and really fun, and exchanging war stories and things. As always, everyone, I'm co-founder and CEO at Dryrun. If you're looking for a way to manage your cash, model your finances, figuring out where you're headed, please come and check us out at dryrun.com. We'd love to talk with you, and one of our staff members would love to walk you through. And we also have a free trial if you'd like to give it a try. Thanks so much, Erin. I really appreciate it, and had a great conversation today with you.
Thanks, Blaine. Hope you have a great day.